Hi, I'm Matt. I'm just a little guy. I don't know anything about game development, but my submission was featured in the Game Maker's Toolkit 2025 Game Jam video. Okay, I guess I owe it to myself to say I know a little bit, like a microscopic amount of game development knowledge. I started learning Godot almost 2 years ago, released a very small puzzle platformer on Steam called You Have to Climb Out in July 2024. As of today, it's sold over 300 copies. That's crazy! Since then, I've done 4 game jams and lost most of them. But I wanted to make a little video just to highlight a few things I've learned about game jams, just in case this helps or inspires somebody else to enter a game jam or start their own game development journey. Shortly after releasing You Have to Climb Out, I entered my first game jam, mostly because I needed a break from looking at that stupid little frog. This was the 2024 Game Maker's Toolkit Game Jam. My submission was Orbital Defense Squad. This game is a tower defense where you're trying to protect the sun from these cute little alien invaders. Each tower is a planet which orbits around the sun. You can enter each tower to search for upgrades or unlock the next tower. Each tower has a unique pilot kind of person, which plays differently from the others. Additionally, while you're exploring the tower is disabled in the tower defense, so you have to be aware of when the next wave is coming. This game was born out of the desire to want to do something during the waves of a tower defense. I often get really bored when I play a tower defense game because I'm just like sitting there watching waves of enemies die for a pretty long period of time. And then when they have like a fast forward button to like skip that, then it makes me question like, okay, like why am I even playing the game then, I guess? Anyway, as far as results go, this game did alright. It's certainly better than I expected for my first ever jam entry. I feared that it would be too easy, so I cranked up the difficulty quite a bit shortly before submitting. More on that later. It also plays quite janky and has some pretty bad UI and tutorial. Finally, as this will be a recurring theme here, I waited until the very last second to add sound and music. I actually spent a good bit of time after the jam trying to make this idea into a full game, but I gave up when I felt like the systems of managing player and tower stats were becoming a bit too much for my tiny little smooth brain to handle. Here's a couple things I learned though. My scope was way too big. For game jam games, you want to think small. You want to think really small. When you think your jam idea is small enough, it needs to be a little bit smaller actually. A polished, small experience is magnitudes better than a sloppy, larger experience. Originally, this game was meant to have 5 different towers, but that is absolutely bonkers, so I had to bring it down to 3, which is still bonkers. Another thing I learned is that game jams will soak up all of your brain power over its period. Nothing really prepared me for the degree of obsession that occurs during the game jam period. For me, the 96 hours of the game jam counted down in my head like the end of the world. I was constantly extremely aware of the number of hours remaining and weighing whether I could really spend 30 minutes preparing lunch, or how long I should spend sleeping, or how long it took me to make a certain mechanic, and whether that amount of time meant I had to start cutting my plans down. Which I did. In addition to that, you will feel incredibly exhausted when the game jam is over, so do a big sleep. My second game jam entry came a few months later for the 2025 Big Mode Game Jam. If you can't quite understand from looking at the screen, the gist of this game is that a traveling magician is in town with a levitation show, and the player acts as his assistant who sits in the audience and remotely controls fans hidden in the magician's clothes and props to keep objects floating in the air. The player assigns their own hotkey to each remote object and then keeps the show going for at least 1 minute to win the level. I don't know how this idea came to me, that's just what I landed on. Honestly, for the scope of gameplay in terms of how much programming was needed to get the game going, I felt like I did really good here. The really hard part on this one was the art. I couldn't really find any free assets that were working out, so I had to draw a lot of stuff from scratch, and I think it looks okay, but art is decidedly not my main thing. Game development requires knowledge of art, sound, music, design, programming, and these are things that people spend their entire lives studying, and you have to just cram them all in within 96 hours or something. So the most challenging part of this was definitely the art. Here's some things I learned on this one. You don't need to use real physics, unless your game really requires it. In this game, you press a button and the balls go up. You don't need to simulate realistic gravity forces and wind forces and inertia, it's just not necessary. It's difficult, and it won't really matter in the end. All I wound up doing is setting the balls to move downward with time unless their fan was on, which would send them up instead. The math becomes so much easier and more straightforward when you pull out all the physics simulation. The second thing I learned, which is actually really important, your game does not need to be difficult. In fact, you should lean toward making it a bit easier than you feel comfortable with. People playing game jam games want to see a unique idea executed from start to finish. They probably don't want to get hung up on learning a strange, small game's mechanics over 20 minutes or something. In this game, I made it so you restart the entire game when you lose, and I think that was a huge mistake, especially for a game with such odd controls. If you really want to sprinkle in some difficulty, add a speedrun timer or some kind of high score tracking so people can post their best times and scores in the comments, but generally, keep it pretty easy. My third game jam submission was Orb of Ruin. This was for Kenny's 2025 Game Jam, and quick shout out if you don't recognize the name Kenny, this person makes a metric ton of absolutely free game assets that are really easy to work with and great for prototyping stuff or filling out your game if you aren't able to create or commission art yourself. My partner and I entered this jam as a team. Yay! It was really the first time I'd worked with somebody on a game. We wound up creating this cute little dungeon crawl where your orb powers contraptions, but you have to juggle leaving it behind and taking it with you. You can also shoot little projectiles, but to refill your energy, you need to be holding the orb. I was very proud of what we were able to make, especially this first boss, who is so adorable. It bounces around the screen, and your orb is powering the only torch in the room, so to refill your energy, you need to be in darkness and hope you're standing in a safe spot. This game jam was a 48-hour one. 48 hours is unbelievably short. You could theoretically sleep for a quarter of that by accident. Here's some things I learned here. Having a partner in a game jam is really amazing. I knew that I could count on her to make art and style decisions and sort of broadly plan out where we were headed, and I could just focus on programming what we needed in that moment. Having a giant chunk of the required brain power be handled by someone else was really, really nice. I don't think I could have finished this short of a game jam by myself. Secondly, holy crap, use free assets if you can. This game jam required using Kenny's free game assets where possible, and at first this felt like a difficult limitation, but it actually showed me how powerful these options are. Being able to throw nice looking player and enemy sprites into your project makes it so much easier to see everything coming together. Okay, SongRunner. I really like the prompt loop. It can be interpreted in a lot of different ways, and they all make for great game ideas. Looking back at the 3 game jam games I'd done so far, I always felt bad that audio and music felt like an afterthought. For all 3 projects, I threw together audio and music haphazardly at the very end before submitting, and that didn't feel right. I thought about what it might be like to actually focus on one or both of those very early in the process instead. For me, loop naturally referred to using music loops. Here's what I learned on this game jam. Having some time at the end to polish your game is an incredible gift. This is probably like one of the most important and obvious game jam tips ever, but it was very easy for me to miss. In all 3 of the previous game jams, I was basically finishing the basic structure of the games with very little time at the end of the jam. With a SongRunner, I had a little bit of wiggle room at the end. I could add little nice touches like the fact that certain UI elements bop along with the music, or the music fading out as you enter these little no music allowed zones. These additions don't add anything to the actual function of the game, but when you see stuff like this in a game jam submission, it makes the entire presentation look way more impressive. Secondly, make the thing first, make it good later. This is probably a cumulative lesson that I've learned across these first 18 months or so of stepping into game design. I don't know if this is like taking over everyone's social media right now or if it's just me, but variations of this comic are everywhere I look. Sure, it's oversimplifying a bit, but it is very helpful when you are trying to build out an idea in code to just slap together the most horrific code you've ever seen, just to make a thing work so that you can evaluate it, see if it's even an idea worth pursuing, then come back and clean up that mess later as you need. And honestly, if we're talking Game Jam submissions, you can kind of skip the second step if you want. Another angle to look at this is that you don't want to paralyze yourself by staring at a blank page, trying to make sure every line of code you write will be perfectly structured. You'll spend a ton of extra time, and when you finally finish, you might find that the idea you spent so long on isn't even that fun. I liked SongRunner so much that right after the Game Jam results period was over, I uploaded a new version with some minor improvements and speedrun tracking, and I'm working on another new version now that will replace a lot of art that I didn't like about my original submission. What the heck was I thinking when I created this player sprite? I don't understand what this is supposed to be, and honestly, I am shocked that Mark chose to feature this game with whatever this thing is in it. And maybe I'll add a few new levels too. That'll be out soon, so follow me on Blue Sky or on Itch to be notified of that, but that's it really. Okay, you made it to the end of the video. Now what? Thanks for watching, I guess? I don't know, I guess if you have any questions, you can leave a comment and, you know, I might check them out eventually and respond. I would say check out some of my other videos, but honestly, maybe don't. Okay, that's all I got. GG's.